Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the wildly fascinating life of a forgotten founding father who fundamentally shaped the United States. We're talking about a guy whose fingerprints are literally all over our nation's founding documents, its physical landscape, and even our financial systems. Yet, somehow his name almost never makes it into modern history textbooks.
So let's start off with a super simple question. Who wrote the words, "We the people"? Now, if you're guessing James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, or maybe Alexander Hamilton, you're definitely not alone. But you'd be entirely wrong. Those famous 7 words actually belong to someone else entirely.
The true author was Gouverneur Morris, who historians actually call the Penman of the Constitution. And he wasn't your typical founder. Unlike the, slightly built, scholarly James Madison, Morris was a towering 6'4" genius with a massive, booming presence, and most notably, a wooden leg. He basically served as the brilliant editor of our nation's founding charter. He took all those unwieldy, incredibly complicated ideas floating around the Constitutional Convention and expertly condensed them into the powerful, unifying language we all know today. Okay, let's just think about this number for a second. 173. This represents the absolutely staggering number of speeches Morris gave at the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And here's the crazy paradox about that number. Business obligations actually caused him to miss more than a whole month of the proceedings. But despite that, he still outspoke literally everyone in the room.
To put that into perspective, the sheer numbers brilliantly show how Morris completely dominated the floor. He spoke more frequently than anyone else, hitting that 173 mark. That is more than James Wilson at 168, and even more than the so-called father of the Constitution himself, James Madison, who came in at 161. Morris used pretty much every single opportunity to vigorously argue for a much stronger national government, an independent executive branch, and crucially, the total abolition of slavery.
You can really see his bold vision for a strong national government and how he edited the Preamble. The original draft he was handed listed every single state individually. It read, "We the people of New Hampshire, Massachusetts," and so on. But Morris strongly believed the Constitution derived its absolute authority from the American people collectively, not just some loose alliance of independent states. So he brilliantly condensed that super cumbersome state-by-state list into the iconic unified phrase, "We the people of the United States." This single, seemingly small edit was an absolute game-changer. It conceptually shifted America from a fractured alliance straight into a single, unified nation.
Part 1, the fiercest abolitionist. Let's shift gears to his moral legacy and see how this builds, because Morris was absolutely the biggest and most vocal opponent of slavery at the convention. In a room where so many delegates were just, tiptoeing around the issue to preserve a very fragile union, Morris assailed the institution with absolute fury and completely zero restraint.
In fact, on August 8, 1787, Morris delivered what is widely considered the very first great abolitionist speech in American public life. He dragged the uncomfortable truth right out onto the convention floor, flat out refusing to let his fellow delegates look the other way. In that speech, he definitely didn't mince words. He called slavery a nefarious institution and went as far as calling it the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. He boldly called out the massive hypocrisy of Southern states wanting political representation for enslaved people while simultaneously continuing the horrific slave trade in defiance of all basic humanity. He challenged that whole 3/5 compromise, demanding to know, well, if enslaved people are men, why not make them citizens and let them vote? And if they're property, why is no other property included in determining political representation? He really hit the nail on the head.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that his anti-slavery efforts extended directly to his editing of the Constitution itself. When the Fugitive Slave Clause was handed to his Committee of Style, the text stated that enslaved people shall be delivered up to the person justly claiming their service. Morris quietly, sneakily struck the word justly right out of the text. And guys, this was absolutely no accident. By doing this, he ensured the Constitution would never ever validate that owning humans was a moral or just act. It was a massive semantic detail that abolitionists would heavily rely on in the decades leading right up to the Civil War.
Part 2, a wild, extraordinary life. Now, outside of his profound political impact, Morris lived an absolutely untamed personal life. It was filled with some really extreme highs and some brutal lows. He was far, far from that stuffy, marble bust image we usually project onto the Founding Fathers. Just think about the incredible physical toll his life took.
At age 14, he accidentally spilled a pot of boiling water, severely scalding and permanently deforming his right arm. Then, in 1780, when he was just 28, a runaway carriage accident in Philadelphia completely shattered his left ankle. The leg actually had to be amputated below the knee, and the wound was treated with a homemade rum-based vinegar, of all things. Yet, despite these horrific physical traumas, he completely refused to let a wooden peg leg and a deformed arm slow down his climbing, his horseback riding, dancing, or his notoriously active romantic life.
And honestly, his energy was just boundless. He was a true Renaissance man, rapidly firing off all these non-constitutional achievements. He actually took the lead on crafting policies for a national currency, officially coining the terms dollars and cents. Later on, he helped lay out the iconic grid system of avenues and streets that completely defines modern Manhattan today. Plus, he was an early champion for the Erie Canal, which totally transformed American commerce. So why does all this matter? Well, because every time you use the word cents to buy a coffee or navigate the grid of streets in New York City, you are directly interacting with Gouverneur Morris's legacy. Oh, and on top of all that, he also served as the U.S. Minister to France during an incredibly volatile time.
Arriving in France in 1789, he witnessed the bloody French Revolution firsthand. In fact, he became the very first and the only foreign diplomat to remain in Paris throughout the entire Reign of Terror. He gave desperate nobles refuge right in his own home and helped prominent figures literally escape the guillotine. And of course, in true Gouverneur Morris fashion, he simultaneously carried on a multi-year, incredibly steamy affair with a French aristocratic novelist. They often conducted their romance right inside the Louvre, which, remember, was a royal palace back then. Naturally, his time in France wasn't without some extreme danger, which leads to one of the most incredible, almost laughable anecdotes of his entire life. Picture this. He's surrounded by a hostile, angry French mob in Paris, and they are threatening to hang him from a lamppost. Morris famously saves his own life by unstrapping his wooden leg, waving it high in the air, and falsely shouting that he had lost his limb fighting for American liberty. The sheer audacity of the move completely won the mob over, and they just let him escape unharmed. No way, right?
After finally returning to the United States, this serial philanderer actually settled down at age 57, which completely stunned his friends. He quietly married his 35-year-old housekeeper, Nancy Randolph. But Nancy's past made this incredibly scandalous. Years earlier, she had stood trial in a highly sensational courtroom spectacle, accused of murdering a newborn child from an alleged affair with her own brother-in-law. She was acquitted, but despite the massive high society scandal, she and Morris actually went on to have a really happy marriage and a son together. Part 3. A bizarre and tragic end. Sadly, a man who survived the American Revolution, political upheaval on 2 continents, literal mob violence, and a severe amputation would end up meeting his end in a way that is incredibly grim and shocking. By 1816, Morris was suffering from severe urinary retention. Desperate for relief and, lacking effective early 19th century medical options, Morris attempted a homemade medical procedure to clear the blockage. He used a piece of whalebone as a makeshift catheter. Obviously, this caused severe internal injuries and a fatal infection. The man who quite literally penned the framework of the American government died at age 64 because of a tragic self-inflicted medical error. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. How does a progressive visionary with such a monumental legacy fade entirely into the background of American memory? We're talking about a man so brilliant and complex that a young Theodore Roosevelt actually wrote a full-length biography admiring him. He gave us our financial vocabulary, he shaped our greatest city, and he gave us the very words, "we the people." Yet today, he is mostly forgotten. Was it his scandalous personal life? Maybe his staunch Federalist views that fell out of favor? Or simply the fact that he was overshadowed by the giants standing around him? It really challenges us to think about who gets remembered in history and who gets completely erased. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.